I'm very pleased to introduce you to today's presenters, my wonderful Resource Center colleagues, Cory, Kozmik, and Chantal Kitamura. Take it away, ladies.
Thank you so much, Patty, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our talk. My name is Cory Kozmik, and I'm an Environment and Enforcement Specialist with the RC.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chantal Kitamura, and I'm also an Environment and Enforcement Specialist with the RC.
And our Land Code Governance Manager, Jennifer Preedy, also joins us today to partake in the questions and answer sessions to follow. So today we're here to discuss how the Framework Agreement can support environmental governance and jurisdiction on First Nations lands. This learning opportunity will provide insight on various tools such as environmental management plans, environmental assessments, laws, and policies. It will also discuss strategies to achieve community-specific objectives, such as building resilience to climate change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to discuss a little bit about today's agenda, our discussion will go as follows. First, we're going to have a brief intro and overview of the RC and the Framework Agreement, followed by discussion on environmental site assessment process, environmental management planning, and then environmental laws, including federal laws, land and environmental laws, environmental protection, and environmental assessment. Also, we will discuss one-on-one support that we offer, followed by a summary of today's topics, and then open it to discussions and questions. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Cory. I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit about the Resource Center for those who might not be familiar. We are a First Nations organization dedicated to supporting First Nations communities who would like to reestablish control over their lands, natural resources, and environment through the government-to-government Framework Agreement on First Nation land management, which I'll refer to as the Framework Agreement moving forward. The Resource Center was established by the Lands Advisory Board to undertake its technical responsibilities to Framework Agreement signatory First Nations through support that provides resources and training programs for the development and implementation of community land codes, and assistance for First Nations who encounter difficulties and request assistance from us to resolve the issue. The Resource Center provides support and assistance to First Nations as they transition through interested developmental and operational phases. And our support services team is the first point of contact for First Nations who would like to access the Resource Center's land code governance training, supports, and tools. At this time, I'd just like to remind everyone that our presentation materials are based on our strategic approach to lands governance and management training, which is centered around the Framework Agreement. Next slide, please. Thanks, Patty. So when it comes to the environment, the Resource Center has staff members who are able to provide support and advice. First Nations can request this support by reaching out to their support services technician. Please remember that when it comes to providing support and advice, our level of involvement is always up to the First Nation. So we can be as involved or as uninvolved as you would like. And next slide, please. Thanks, Patty. So this slide shows a number of acronyms that we'll be using throughout our presentation. I'm going to run through them and provide some definitions that will set the stage for the rest of our presentation. So first we have ESA, which is Environmental Site Assessment. An ESA identifies, tests, and remediates areas of environmental concern on a First Nations reserve lands. It's typically completed in 3 phases. So we have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And it's important to note that the results of the phase 1 ESA contribute to a First Nations individual agreement with Canada. Next, we have EMP. So that stands for Environmental Management Plan. An EMP is a planning tool that identifies key environmental issues and priority areas on reserve lands. And it proposes strategies to address the identified environmental issues and priority areas. An EMP is developed with extensive community engagement, and it includes an implementation plan that can form the basic work plan for a First Nations Lands and Environment Department. Next, we have EP, or environmental protection. This sets out the maximum acceptable levels of a particular substance in the environment before it is considered a contaminant. First Nation EP laws meet or beat provincial standards and punishments. Finally, we have environmental assessment, or EA. So an EA is a decision-making tool. It predicts the potential environmental, social, and cultural effects of a proposed project before the project occurs. An EA also proposes mitigation measures to reduce or eliminate the predicted effects of a project, and it includes public consultation. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this slide introduces the Framework Agreement on First Nations Land Management, which again, I'll just refer to that as the Framework Agreement. The Framework Agreement was launched in the late 1980s by a small group of First Nation chiefs. And what it is a government-to-government agreement through which the federal government recognizes First Nation self-government authority over their reserve lands, natural resources, and the environment. The Framework Agreement identifies the jurisdiction assumed by First Nations, including First Nations decision-making authority, as well as the power to design and enforce laws over First Nation reserve lands and resources. The Framework Agreement is ratified by enacting a land code. So once land code is enacted, the land management provisions, which make up approximately 44 sections of the Indian Act, they no longer apply. Next slide, please.
Thanks. So to discuss a little further the environmental site assessment process, what is an ESA? Well, as mentioned, the ESAs confirm the absence or presence of contamination, and they were originally developed to provide information to banks or other mortgage lenders about the environmental liability associated with properties of interest. Hence, ESAs now focus on identifying contaminants that could reduce the value of a property or that could result in risk or liability associated with environmental or human health effects on the contaminated land. So, first, what happens in the context of a First Nation is that the First Nation is interested in becoming a signatory to the Framework Agreement. Then they enter the developmental phase under the Framework Agreement, and then this is where the first stage ESA happens. And then after that, the land code and individual agreement is approved by the community. And if necessary, a phase 2 or a phase 3 ESA will commence. And the phase 1 provides the First Nation with a snapshot of the environmental conditions of their reserve lands prior to the change in land management jurisdiction from Canada to the First Nation. And the results of the phase 1 ESA are included with the First Nations individual agreement with Canada. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, there are 3 different phases of the environmental site assessment process, starting with the first phase. And the first phase aims to identify areas of potential environmental concern, also known as APEX. This process entails a records review pertaining to environmental matters obtained by Canada, the First Nation, and other sources, community meetings, interviews, and knowledgeable First Nation staff, elders, and community members with them, site visits to areas of notable concern to visualize the indicators that would suggest potential contamination, and the preparation of a report describing areas of potential concern, areas of environmental concern, and other general housekeeping issues and recommendations for further study if needed. Whereas the second phase aims to confirm those areas of environmental concern, and this consists of sample collection and analysis of the impacted medium and areas, both water, soil samples, etc., comparing those samples to federal and provincial environmental standards and guidelines for land and water, and recommendations for further action associated with any estimated costs. And then that would enter the third phase of the ESA process, which aims to remediate those areas of environmental concern by first delineating the extent of the contamination and identifying the exposure pathways, modeling and risk assessment, followed by recommendations, which is the design and implementation of any necessary remedial works. Next slide, please. And the environmental site assessment process is overseen by a joint management committee. And this usually consists of a representative from the First Nation and one representative from Indigenous Services Canada, or ISC. And in instances when parties may have different numbers on participants to the JMC, there remains an equal voice in decision-making between the First Nation and ISC. And if requested by the First Nation, the Resource Center may attend any or all meetings and participate in the JMC to provide technical support to the First Nation as a non-voting member. Next slide, please. So just to discuss a little further on how this process looks, the ESA Phase 1 is a multi-step process that the RC can be involved with as much or as little as the First Nation requests. First, a request for proposal is developed with the First Nation, and that contains terms of reference, areas of interest, and any notable concerns and tasks. It entails a general description of the reserve lands to be assessed, any list of past environmental reports that have been completed on reserve lands, any areas of concern that were identified by the JMC, a description of the work to be completed, followed by a schedule for completion. And then the RFP, the request for proposal, is then distributed to a list of qualified environmental consultants as agreed upon by the JMC. And once a consultant has been awarded the work, they complete their assessment, prepare a draft report, and submit it to the JMC for review. During this time, the RC is also available to provide a review and comments on the document to ensure the job was thorough and the best interests of the First Nation are met. Once revisions have been completed, the consultant will then finalize the report and include any recommendations for a Phase 2 with associated cost estimates. The results of the Phase 1 are included into the First Nations individual agreement with Canada. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Cory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental management plans, which I'll refer to as an EMP. As I mentioned earlier, an EMP is a planning tool that identifies key environmental issues and priority areas on your reserve lands, such as air, water, soil, solid waste management, cultural resources, and climate change. An EMP also proposes key strategies to address and manage the identified environmental issues and priority areas. So for example, education programs, monitoring, as well as the development and implementation of policies and laws. Another important component of your EMP is the implementation plan. This is a really helpful tool as it becomes the basic work plan for your lands and environment department. It identifies what you're going to do, when these tasks should take place, and it assigns responsible parties to complete each task. Lastly, I'd just like to mention that while there's no legal requirement to prepare an EMP, we do really recommend them as they help with setting the direction for the environmental management on your reserve lands. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the EMP development process involves thorough community engagement. And this helps to ensure that your EMP reflects the specific environmental issues and priority areas that are important to your community. Community engagement provides an excellent opportunity to bring everyone together, to ask questions, learn, talk about the environmental issues that are impacting the community, and work together to identify what can be done. By involving elders and youth, community engagement also promotes the transfer of intergenerational knowledge about the land. The thing I really like about community engagement is that it can be designed in so many different ways, and you can incorporate fun activities that are both unique and engaging. Next slide, please. Thanks. So on this slide, I'm going to talk about one of the Resource Center's funding programs. The Resource Center supports a collaborative EMP funding program, which provides funding and technical support to limited groups of operational First Nations to develop their individual EMPs. So funding is administered through a milestone-based funding agreement where a total of $80,000 is provided directly to approved First Nations. Additional support is available to First Nations that have completed their EMPs under this program. This funding is for the first year of EMP implementation, and it consists of $120,000 per approved First Nation. This funding can be used to support the strategies that have been identified in your EMP. So, for example, if your EMP identifies that you will be developing environmental laws or conducting environmental monitoring, the implementation funding can help to support these activities. And I'll just add that for this year, 2021 to 2022, funding under this program is limited currently to 10 entrants. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in addition to our collaborative EMP funding program, the Resource Center offers additional support tools that can assist with the development of individual EMPs. Our support includes EMP webinars and online courses, which are accessible on our website. We also provide sample EMPs that have been put together by other First Nations. And we can review and comment on draft EMPs, as well as provide one-on-one support for any specific issues or questions that might come up along the way. And next slide, please.
Thank you. So under the framework agreement, some federal environmental laws continue to apply on reserve lands. An example of these laws are Species at Risk Act, the Migratory Birds Convention Act, the Fisheries Act, and the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So this slide speaks to the framework agreement and environmental laws. I spoke to lawmaking authority a bit earlier, but I'll just mention again that under the framework agreement, the Council of a First Nation with a land code in effect has the power and authority to make environmental laws relating to First Nation land. Under the framework agreement, a First Nation with a land code in effect will develop both an environmental protection and an environmental assessment regime that will be implemented through First Nation laws. There are other environmental laws that you may wish to consider developing. Some examples include, but are not limited to, contaminants on First Nation land, environmental protection requirements, including requirements in respect of natural resources, soils, water, and groundwater, environmental emergencies and natural disasters, conservation and heritage management requirements, implementation of any provisions of a First Nation environmental management plan, recycling, solid waste and garbage disposal, nuisances including noise, odors, and vibrations, unsightly premises, and lastly, sewage and effluent discharges. Next slide, please.
Thanks. So in the context of First Nation laws and climate change, Land Code First Nations can enact laws to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So for example, land use plans and zoning, your First Nation has the ability to choose the allowable or prohibited developments that occur on your lands. For example, some land use plans have developed policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from on-reserve activities. With environmental management plans, First Nation can an EMP can develop standard procedures that address specific environmental issues, such as the quality of air, which could inform policy and laws to reduce emissions, but also inform directions for other environmental issues associated with climate change, such as the quality of air, water, and even habitats. With environmental assessments, they aim to identify potential effects from a project on the environment. So, the EA laws can assess the carbon footprint of a project, require a proponent to perform a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, so your First Nation can better understand climate change related impacts to your land as they relate to the development and project activities. The development procedures laws and subdivision development and servicing laws, or SDS laws, can also specify what kind of engineering design standards infrastructure must meet, for example, stormwater drainage. With regards to environmental protection, EP laws can consider greenhouse gases to be hazardous waste with certain exemptions. So a permit would have to be provided from the lands department prior to the greenhouse gases activities occurring. And the permit could also outline the expected quantities of greenhouse gases to be emitted as decided by the First Nation. With regards to enforcement and ticketing laws, if someone is in violation of these environmental laws, you'll want some good enforcement regime to be able to issue tickets and violations. So even with a business permitting law, as we know, most businesses require a business permit for their local authority in order to secure financing and insurance. So this is another way for the nation to ensure that a given business activity is in compliance with all laws, including environmental laws. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So under the framework agreement, First Nations have the authority to enforce their land code and their First Nation laws, including their environmental laws. So with that said, First Nations have the power to establish comprehensive enforcement procedures, appoint justices of the peace, establish offenses, provide for fines, imprisonment, restitution, and community service, as well as alternative means for achieving compliance with their laws. First Nations can carry out inspections, searches, seizures, compulsory sampling, testing, and the production of information. And finally, First Nations can provide for the collection of non-tax debts, fees, and charges owed to the First Nation. The Resource Center has a wonderful enforcement team, and this morning, Kevin, Michelle, and Gail delivered an excellent presentation on law development and enforcement. If you weren't able to catch this presentation or would like further information on the topic, the presentation will be available online, and you can also reach out to your support services technician and they can assist you with any further questions that you might have. Next slide, please. Thank you. When it comes to environmental laws, the Resource Center can assist in determining where environmental laws are required, and we can assist with environmental law development by providing sample laws from other First Nations, reviewing and commenting on draft laws to ensure that provisions, offenses, and enforcement measures are appropriate. And we can work with federal and provincial agencies to promote recognition of Land Code First Nation environmental laws. It's also important to note that the Resource Center support for environmental laws does not replace the need for a First Nation to retain independent legal advice, but it can help to reduce legal costs for both environmental law development as well as adjudication. Next slide, please.
Thanks. So with regard to environmental protection, it aims to set out maximum acceptable levels of a particular substance in the environment before it is considered a contaminant. So it's a standard or criteria. And it's defined as efforts to identify, prevent, and remediate any contamination of soil, water, and air, reducing health and safety risks to humans and the environment. So it sets that standard or criteria of those acceptable levels of a substance before it's considered to be a contaminant. And the framework agreement provides that a First Nation will establish environmental protection laws which meet or exceed provincial standards for the province in which the First Nation is located. It is also best to be aware of the standards that you're setting, however, as you don't want to set a standard that's too high that sets your community up to exceed them. Next slide, please. Thanks. So some common examples of potentially contaminating activities on reserve include hazardous substances such as contaminants or spills, solid wastes, fuel storage tank and management of those, sewage treatments, environmental emergencies, and also deposit of fill from unknown sources. Next slide, please. Thank you. So environmental assessment is a decision-making tool that predicts the potential environmental, social, and cultural effects of a proposed project before it occurs. It proposes mitigation measures to reduce or eliminate those identified effects, and it also includes a public consultation process. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So this slide here touches on some EA considerations. As we mentioned earlier, under the framework agreement, a First Nation with a land code in effect will develop an environmental assessment regime that will be implemented through First Nation laws. So when you go to develop your own EA law, it's important to remember that your law can take into consideration the things that are important to your community. And this is really helpful to make an informed decision about a proposed development project. So for example, if there are culturally significant areas on your reserve lands, such as archaeological sites, harvesting sites, or spiritually significant areas, your EA law could be developed to take into consideration how a proposed development project might impact these areas. Similarly, if you have traditional plants, culturally significant wildlife, or medicines that you would like to have considered as part of your EA law, this is also something that can be done. And as a final example here, if you like, your EA law could even include consideration for how a proposed development project might contribute to climate change. This could be done, for example, by requiring that an assessment of a development project's carbon footprint be completed as part of the EA. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when it comes to EAs, the Resource Center can provide a variety of supports. We can help you walk through the EA process to determine which EA process will work for you, given the resources that you have and the conditions of your reserve lands. We can assist with the development and implementation of policies and procedures under a First Nations interim EA process. Additionally, we can assist with the development of your EA law by providing sample laws from other First Nations, reviewing draft EA laws to ensure that the provisions, contraventions, and enforcement measures are appropriate. And we can assist with testing the proposed EA process in a First Nations draft EA law to ensure that the proposed process will work within your administrative structure, includes public consultation, and provide sufficient information to be able to make an informed decision about a proposed development. With that said, I'd like to note again that First Nations will still need to seek independent legal advice on their EA law. Next slide, please.
Thanks. So to discuss what some one-on-one support looks like, the RC can provide this one-on-one support to assist with community-specific requests. And some examples of this include unique environmental issues that are very specific to your community and landscape, education and training for any land staff, committees, and even leadership. We can help with promoting networking and provide advice on environmental law development, as was discussed, including support on various incidences, emergencies, any arising environmental concerns, and also support for climate change, such as things like adaptation planning, climate change monitoring, and community-based initiatives. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned before, there are some various funding opportunities with the RC, starting with the Collaborative Environmental Management Plan, or the EMP, that was previously discussed, but I'll touch on it again. And it's a collaborative-based approach, and that funds up to 10 First Nations annually to develop their EMP. And it's a milestone-based funding agreement, and eligible First Nations receive up to $80,000 each to develop their EMP. And additional support is also available to First Nations that complete their EMPs under the collaborative funding program for the first year of the EMP implementation. The Solid Waste Management Fund supports solid waste management plans, solid waste laws, landfill and transfer station improvements, operations and maintenance plans, feasibility studies, waste diversion programs, bin and equipment purchases, also waste reuse programs, and helps with unauthorized dump site cleanups. And the legacy funding offers support for things such as long-standing cleanup and waste removal activities, for things such as landfills or dumps or even illegal dump sites, and also can assist with other waste removal or contaminated site activities that are not covered by the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan. And this legacy funding has also supported surveying projects, for example, research on traditional land holdings, resolution of survey boundaries and issues. Next slide, please. So finally, environmental governance for Land Code First Nations is supported by various tools that provide a First Nation a wide range of opportunities to put their environment in the forefront of their land use planning, laws, and development. So once again, these look like your environmental site assessment process, phase 1, 2, and 3, development and implementation of your environmental management plans, environmental laws assistance, environmental assessments, environmental protection regimes, one-on-one support, and RC funding to support land governance strategies. So if you're an interested First Nation at Land Code First Nation, please contact your RC support services technician for environmental support, resources, and assistance. And I want to thank you for joining us on our wonderful adventure through environmental governance under Land Code. And without further ado, we'll hop right into the questions and discussion session. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cory and Chantal. That was wonderful. We'd like to open it up now to participants. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, I did see one in the chat related to, is the funding cap provincial or Canada-wide? So Jennifer did answer that one, that it's Canada-wide and currently limited to operational First Nations. Is that respecting just the environmental management plan funding, or is that also solid waste management?
I believe it's for all operational First Nations, the funding to move forward with processes to support things like the EMP, solid waste management, legacy funding, etc.
That's great. Thanks, Cory. Do we have any questions from any of the participants? Oh, here we have one. How would the First Nation Environmental Assessment Acts coincide with the federal impact assessment legislation?
That is a great question. I'm actually going to turn this one over to Jennifer Preety, our manager.
Sure. One of the things that we've been working on quite a bit actually is how to harmonize the new Federal Impact Assessment Act with First Nations environmental assessment processes on their reserve lands. So the idea is, you know, how do we work these two processes together for a project that perhaps requires an assessment under both pieces of legislation? So for example, if you know, the project's on First Nation land and the federal government is providing funding through one of their programs, you're kind of in that spot where you're triggering both acts and both assessments. And so we still want to operate on that whole process of one project, one environmental assessment, while still respecting the First Nations Land Governance Authority and their jurisdiction over environmental assessment on reserve. So it's really been a matter of how can the Impact Assessment Act work with whether it's the interim assessment process that First Nations are following or their own First Nation law, not necessarily how we have to work with them. We've been really, you know, focusing on the jurisdiction of First Nations. So ideally what we want to do is have the federal government, whichever agency that happens to be, actually work with the First Nation at an early stage to determine what the First Nations environmental assessment process is, and then to try to use that process in lieu of theirs, to substitute in the First Nations process in lieu of the federal process, or to make sure that, you know, when we're looking at the scope of the assessment or the factors that need to be considered during that environmental assessment, that it really that they're really developed so that they will fit and meet the needs of both of those assessments. And then ideally, you know, if a First Nation, of course, doesn't agree with the project, then obviously the environmental impact assessment, that would be the opinion that they would receive from the First Nation as part of their requirements for getting community approval, and the project wouldn't be able to go ahead. So it's really is the First Nations environmental assessment process takes priority.
Thanks, Jennifer. Another question from Denise. Does a First Nation need to go through the EA process even for their own projects? Kind of ties in.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to take this question again.
They give it to you.
In your individual agreement with Canada, there's a section that deals with the interim environmental the interim environmental assessment process, the process that you need to follow until you actually enact your law. And it says right in that individual agreement that, you know, anytime the First Nation is funding, approving, making any decisions or taking any actions essentially that would allow a project to occur, they need to undergo that environmental assessment. Now, because you're developing your law, and I mean, it does need to be equal across the board, whether it's a project that is being undertaken by council or by the community, or whether it's a third party project, your law has to be applied equally to everyone. But because you have the ability to develop an environmental assessment process that works for your community, you can consider things like having, for example, an exclusion list, or almost like a class environmental assessment process, where there's certain types of projects that you know as a community or that you've done the research on that aren't likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects. And then so those can be exempt from your environmental assessment process. Or you can have different levels of environmental assessment where some of these sort of minor type projects only require a very preliminary screening type assessment, just because otherwise, you know, anytime you put shovel to the ground, as a community, you may be having to undertake an environmental assessment, which doesn't really help. You know, it's not providing any benefit to environmental management, and it's just making things difficult for your community to get things done.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that front end consideration, taking the time to really consider the different projects that may be coming based maybe on a land use plan or other plans, how you might treat those in terms of exclusions or inclusions, and then being consistent in however you did choose to apply your laws and policies. That's awesome. We have another question from Dawn, Cory or Chantal. When a nation is FNLM operational, does the First Nation complete ESAs and EIAs, or do they hire consultants, or does the RC help with these?
Thanks, Dawn. That's a great question. So typically, with regards to the environmental site assessment process, the First Nation chooses a qualified professional consultant to complete the ESA, and also sometimes the environmental site or the environmental assessment process and impact assessment process. And the RC does help with this, with whatever level of help the First Nation requires of us. So we can help put together the statement of work that discusses the scope of the project. We can also assist with reviewing those draft reports and having discussions with regards to those and the recommendations and considerations to be made, and also supporting the First Nation throughout to ensure that they have the confidence in what they're understanding, because some of these processes are very intense, and some of the reports are very technical. So we're always available to help the First Nation work through the document and have a firm understanding of what it's discussing and help with the recommendations if necessary. But yeah, so the other question was, can the First Nation do the assessment? Not typically, just unless there is an environmental or qualified environmental professional that is chosen from the list of applicants within that process. So the ESA process does bring in several potential consultants that are evaluated through a couple different processes by both ISC and the First Nations RC support systems. And then it is discussed on the consultant who is the best for the job, and then they're appointed the work to move forward with that. I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Cory. I'm curious, just to build off of that, if there is a role for the First Nation in working with those consultants, like is there a capacity element to a project, even though they may not be the ones doing the ESA, how might their staff participate in the process?
Well, typically during all of the statement of works that are sent out for the consultants to review and then prepare a proposal for, it does include engagement with community members and involvement with community members on this project, because it's very important to ensure that the community is very well engaged and very well informed on the whole process and involved as much as possible, because this pertains specifically to their reserve lands. So heavy engagement with the community is very important, but also including members of staff as mentioned in the statement of work, and also as stated in the consultant's proposal, that they recognize that this is part of the process and plan to implement as such.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Cory. Our next question comes from Valerie. How many First Nation environmental assessment process has been acknowledged and honored by the federal government? And then part 2 of that question, how do you apply, enforce your EA process to a CP holder?
I think I'll hand that question to Jennifer.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you.
Well, under the framework agreement, part of your jurisdiction for land governance, we no longer require ministerial or federal approval of our laws and processes that we undertake for environmental assessments. You're no longer accountable to the federal government. It's the accountability to, the First Nation and your community members. So when you undertake an environmental assessment for a particular project that's occurring on your land, the results of that environmental assessment are prepared for your community members, for your chief and council to use as a basis to make a decision on, whether or not that project's likely to cause any adverse environmental effects. And then stemming from that, whether or not they should actually issue any permits or approvals, leases, etc., that would allow that project to occur. So that's kind of how that works in. And then in terms of enforcing your EA process on a CP holder, all of your environmental laws, all of your First Nation laws developed under Land Code apply on all reserve lands, whether it's ban land, whether it's CP land or other traditional allocated lands. So this becomes sort of an enforcement question. You need to have strong laws to be able to enforce it. Making sure that you write your laws in a way that they can be enforced. That you have those strong enforcement provisions, that you educate your community on what the content of the law and the process is, so that it's easy to follow. And then you can also add in enforcement mechanisms such as, if there is an approval or a permit or funding required by council for that project to occur, perhaps if in your development of that project, if the EA step isn't completed, then they can't move on to the next steps. They can't receive those permits. So if you have like business permits or anything like that, and it's associated with that, then you have a requirement for making sure the environmental assessment is done before any of those permits or anything are issued. There's other ways that things that you can use to enforce your laws, other types of penalties that you can work in, fines, tickets, stop work orders, that kind of thing. It's really what works for your community and what you have the capacity and the capability to enforce, given your processes. You can use those tools to really help enforce your laws.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. Do we have any other questions from any of the participants? Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask it yourself, or post it in the chat.
Hi, it's Valerie again. The reason that I asked that question is we have a challenge with a CP holder who has decided to allow homeless people to set up camp. And they're pretty adjacent to the Fraser River, which is probably one of the most important salmon-bearing rivers on the planet. They've now started using PVC pipe to transport raw sewage to the water. We asked that they remove it, but that's about all that's been able to happen. We're growing exceedingly concerned about what it's going to do. being so close to the Fraser. But enforcement is virtually impossible. This person thinks they're immune to everything that's his land. He can do whatever he wants with it. But I appreciate you sharing, because it was helpful to know what you were able to answer for me, because 25 years ago when I was first in lands, the landscape literally was so different. And I've learned so much in this last 2 days. It's beyond ridiculous. So I'm really excited about sopping up more and more information as I go. But thank you very much for the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Valerie. Out of curiosity, are you working with a community that has a land code or is in the process of developing one?
They're just in the early stages of doing one. I actually was the emergency program coordinator and was running the EOC for the last year.
Okay, well, if you'd
and
like
trying to get them to understand why the emergency plan would fall within lands, and that this particular individual is actually putting the larger community at risk with the people that he's allowing to stay there. We've already had 2 huge trailer fires, which the local fire department had a challenge getting to. Both times they had to let the fires go because they had no way of safely reaching the units. But the people that are living there obviously have their substance and alcohol use problems and stuff, and it just brings a whole new level of challenge.
Absolutely.
We haven't been able to resolve it yet.
Yeah, very challenging in dealing with some of those broader social issues that impact the land as well, and a challenge there. But if you'd like to continue that conversation one-on-one, please feel free to reach out to your support services technician, or depending on whether you fall within the Fraser Valley or the rest of BC, feel free to reach out to myself or Denise, and we'll be happy to.
And I've encouraged the land code manager to reach out, because she said to me one day, she goes, "Well, it's not being done anywhere else." I said, "Well, then set precedent." I said, "Communities have done it. We know that already. So be the one that sets the precedent for how this goes down." But I'll definitely relay that information to her. And thank you for answering me and giving me time to ask questions.
Absolutely. We really appreciate your questions, Valerie. It's really important issues that First Nations are dealing with, and some of them are quite challenging to navigate a particular solution, because it usually involves departments and other jurisdictions, and depending on what your situation is, there may be different authorities that you have or do not have yet that come into play. I did notice one hand raised. David, would you still like to ask a question? No? Okay, I think he's good. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to speak to?
I think I saw David pop up there for a second. See if
I did pop up for a second. Just wanted to quickly acknowledge Valerie and your comments, and really appreciate the difficult situation that you described. We may be able to help you behind the scenes with both advice and expertise while your community is going through with the developmental side. So feel free to reach out to me. My email I can put into the chat, but it's simply david.russell@canada.ca, and we can follow up with you offline.
I appreciate that, David, because the biggest concern we have is that river just flows by the community. And there's so many more First Nations who live off that water. So it's critical to us to help resolve it amicably. You know, we've tried explaining to this individual that the people that he's allowing to stay there are his responsibility, especially if he's receiving rent. Apparently they're giving him money to stay there. How much, we don't know, and we really don't care. We're just concerned about the fact that they, when COVID first started, we decided that we didn't want to boot them out and just send them off into the world with the craziness that was going on last year. So we put up a porta potty for 6 months at our expense. But eventually that money ran out and we just had to remove it. So they just do whatever. And then we just happened to discover when we were dealing with Frechette last year, my coworker and deputy director at the EOC got in his canoe and did a paddle just to look at what the water was doing and discovered the PVC pipe. And we kicked into extremely high gear at that point and demanded that it be removed that day. And my understanding is between himself and the land code manager and me, we called everybody we could think of to try to make this stop. Like, it's one thing for it to be specific to that community, but when it involves the Fraser River and everything it's gone through in the last number of years, and the fact that so many other communities live off that river, it's got to be our number one priority right now. So I appreciate you sharing.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thanks, Valerie. Denise, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just a quick comment. So Valerie, I am aware of this situation and I will reach out to the coordinator. We have actually dealt with the environmental folks at ISK as well in the past on this particular parcel. And also speaking with council on options to prevent trespass and whatnot at this point while they're still under the Indian Act. So I will follow up with the coordinator on this again though.
So you're familiar with it then?
I am.
Oh, I appreciate that, Denise.
No problem.
Because I explained to my counterpart, I just love her to pieces. She unfortunately couldn't get into this event because it was too last minute, but I wanted to be sure I asked the question because it's been on our minds, and I recently just left there from my emergency management position and moved into lands with another community, but I know that this is still a hot issue with them. So thank you for that, Denise.
Thanks a lot, Valerie and Denise and David, for your comments to that particular issue. Are there any other questions or comments from the floor for Chantal or Cory or Jennifer? No. All right then. Well, I just want to give just a couple more slides respecting how to access support. So you heard about a lot of the great services and funding that is available through our land code governance team, and you may be interested in how to access those. So each community that is interested or is already developing or implementing a land code has a support services technician. That is your main point of contact. If you're not sure of who that point of contact is, feel free to email myself or Denise Unger, who can help direct you to whoever you need to be connecting with, and they can help set up these one-on-one and other support sessions with our land code governance team. Really want to thank everybody for taking the time to participate in today's workshop, and we really look forward to working with you on more of these issues and some funding programs and planning, and there's just so much exciting stuff that's happening in the area of environmental governance. And I know that it's been one area that people always have so much questions and concerns. So I really want to thank everybody for taking the time to participate today. I really want to thank Cory and Chantal for a wonderful presentation that really helped summarize all of the different key aspects of what environmental governance under the framework agreement and land code consists of. What are some of those considerations? What are some of the supports and funding and other resources that are available to you to help accomplish what your community's vision, goals, and other objectives are in that session? And we really want to work with you in resolving whatever it is that you're tackling. I'll open it up to Cory and Chantal again for any closing remarks that you have. And then I do see we do have Oh, those are clapping. It's not a hand raise. So I thought it was another hand raise, but no, we got a clap. Thank you, Valerie. So I'll give it to you, Chantal and Cory, for any last remarks that you may have.
Thanks, Patty. I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to share the fun of what environmental governance for a land code First Nation can look like. And we're a great team full of lots of help. So don't ever hesitate to reach out if you're interested in seeking any support from us. And we'll be very, very happy to work with you. And I'll hand it over to Chantal.
Thanks, Cory. I just want to echo your thoughts there. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. It was a pleasure to be here with everyone. So thanks again.